Welcome back to the Organic Matrix channel, and today we're going to be speaking about the influence of eugenics on the East Coast. Now, we're going to jump back into history about 100 years ago, where things were surprisingly a lot different than how things are today. And I wish I can come up here and say, these are some great times, but there's some terrifying times if you were someone of color, of any color. I mean, if you were white-skinned and brown-haired, you were in danger too. And I feel like it's not spoken about enough how prejudice works. Prejudice it's not just about one color being hated on, but it's about people being afraid of the differences that we all have from our heritage, and how other people were so afraid of these differences that they oppressed people like you and I. As we go into this episode, I want to pay homage to the people of our past and thank everybody who fought for our freedoms in every sense of the word. Enjoy the show, and of course, disclaimer, the show will have racist undertones, it will be triggering, and it's meant to preserve the history and memory of our people. Eugenics was a movement that began in the early 20th century based on the premise that specific groups of people were of a master race. The idea was first popularized by Francis Galton, an Englishman influenced by his cousin Charles Darwin's theory on natural selection. He believed that genius could be passed down through your genes. And he also believed that negative traits could be passed down as well. He believed that negative traits could be controlled and eliminated from society. Eugenicists around the world took up this mantle, including America, where eugenists like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller Jr. funded institutions dedicated to eradicating diseases like mental illness from our gene pool altogether. Their efforts resulted in over 60% of institutionalized Americans being sterilized against their will, with many believing it would prevent them from passing down mental illness or chronic disease to their children. Eugenics was a movement that began in early 20th century based on the premise that specific groups of people were a master race. And we all know what the master race apparently looked like. The master race was depicted as a Nordic person, someone with white skin, blonde hair, and blue eyes. Now, the biggest problem I have with the way eugenicists spoke about the eugenics project, there was no scientific evidence that this genetic model was a master race. There's no dominant genes, recessive genes, better immunity. Like, there was no data that would provide evidence for what they were claiming. So for all of us who has been stereotyped in the past, we know that they were using the term eugenics so that they can stereotype and profile people of color. That's what I'm understanding. Galton believed that a certain social class was superior to others, and he attempted to test this theory in order to determine whether or not someone belonged in the superior group. He encouraged people whose lineage was considered inferior, poor, and had fewer children than those lineage who was considered superior, rich. The term eugenics has since been replaced by genetics. Genetics is really just another word for science, the study of genes and their impact on human behavior, but it was not completely lost its eugenics connotations. In fact, we still use the terms like genetic predisposition when talked about things like disease traits, mental illness, or even personality characteristics such as shyness or extroversion. These terms imply that your genetics determine who you are rather than how much effort you put into being yourself. But he also believed that negative traits can be controlled and eliminated from society. In his own words, if we can breed cattle for the butcher and horses for knacker, surely it should be easy to breed a race of intelligent human beings. His book, Heredity of Genius, 1969, proposed that genius is hereditary. That is, it can be passed down through genes. But this turned out not to be true. In actuality, heredity and environment have an equal influence on intelligence. Both nature and nurture play a part in shaping one's intellectual abilities. His book, though Galton didn't know it at the time, his idea that intelligence could be inherited was wrong. Today we know that genius is not genetic, but rather developed through education and practice. Even if those who are not naturally gifted with great intelligence don't seem like they've worked out for their skill. Today we know genius is not genetic, but rather developed through education and practice. Even if those who are naturally gifted with great intellect don't seem like they've worked for their skill or knowledge at all. The truth is that natural talent alone does not make someone brilliant. If anything, you'll find most geniuses are incredibly hard workers who devote themselves fully to their craft over an extended period of time before achieving success. Even when they do succeed, they often continue working hard throughout their lives because they learning new things every day, just as much as any other person would love eating ice cream sundaes every day. They're like true workaholics. And when I read that paragraph, the person that I thought about the most was Elon Musk. So thank you, Elon Musk, for being a true inventor because you are dedicated to your craft. And I hope many more humans are inspired by his efforts. While some people may argue otherwise by pointing out negative traits such as criminality, which will appear to run in families over many generations, these ideas and these concepts eventually led to the rise of a racist ideology that contaminated America and Germany, with Madison Grant claiming that the blood Nordic type was superior to other races, but they didn't have any evidence. The Passing of the Great Race was written by Madison Grant, a prominent eugenicist who believes that Nordic race was superior to all others. He also thought that it should be preserved at all costs and felt it threatened by intermarriage with other races as well as immigration from non-Nordic countries. This book is considered the most influential text in eugenics in America, having been widely read and translated into other languages. Keep in mind that this is during the battle of human rights during the Jim Crow laws from 1865 to 1877. So these people were so prejudiced that they were just clinging on to any excuse that they could institutionalize and sterilize our people. That's how insecure, like they saw freedom and immigration as a threat to their race. And it shocks me that people still feel that way today. And in 1896 through 1950s, Jim Crow's laws spread across the country, segregating schools, parks, businesses, sports, churches, hospitals, and many other areas of life. Which shocked me because in church, the Bible criticized the Egyptians for having the Jews as slaves, the Hebrews as slaves. And Moses had to come in and tell the Egyptians, like, you're treating my people like poop. This needs to change. I'm taking them back. So it just shocks me that there was these kind of prejudice, especially in like religious parts of our country in America, that still carry on racist gestures. Meanwhile, the Hebrews were slaves and they were freed. So to me, it's like, why is it that something that happened like thousands of years ago, like the enemy, is seen as like this bad entity? How can people go to church and let these things happen? I just don't understand. I don't get it. Andrew Carnegie was a philanthropist who donated the bulk of he wasn't your typical generous rich guy. In his mind, his money was being given away to improve society. It was to make sure poor people had access to basic necessities like education, food, shelter. In fact, Carnegie believed that charity was one of the best ways to improve society, and in order for him and others to do so effectively, they needed to understand how genetics could be leveraged towards this goal. This sounds so sketchy to me because now when we look at society and we wonder, why are things a certain way? This paragraph tells us exactly why. Because the people who are wealthy influence the trajectory of where our society goes, because they're directly affiliated with the funding of our country. So while I was doing research on eugenics, the thing that like struck me the most was that Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller was funding Germany to exercise eugenic experiments before the World War II happened. So before Hitler was going off about the master race, keep in mind that America was funding these scientists before it became a giant problem globally. I would love to hear what you think about this in the comments. Now we look back in our history books and we're like, oh my God, Hitler was such a bad guy. But Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller was funding him, like funding, maybe not funding Hitler directly, but he was propagating the same information that influenced Hitler to put a target on the Jewish people's backs. So, and then if that never stopped, he would have not stopped at that Hebrew race. He would have came after African Americans, Irish. You can't hide from racism. This led Andrew Carnegie towards eugenics, a field which posits that certain characteristics within human populations should be selectively bred through selective reproduction, having children with those who are deemed genetically superior. While this might sound awful from today's perspective, where there's no longer much consensus over what superior means or what traits make someone worthy of breeding with another person, during Carnegie's time, it wasn't so controversial at all, because many prominent thinkers agreed on its utility and necessity, including Alexander Graham Bell, who invented the telephone, Thomas Edison, who invented electricity, and even John D. Rockefeller, who helped establish Rockefeller Foundation in 1913 as a part of his plan for social betterment through science education. However, who's to say these practices are over with today? Who's to say that? Because these things are being overlooked. The American Breeders Association, founded in 1903, served as an organization where eugenicists could come together and share their work to further the movement. The ABA was made up of scientists, doctors, social workers who were interested in the study of heredity. The organization sponsored conferences and published journals on eugenic subjects, including race, suicide, survival of the fittest, euthanasia, and sterilization. It was a forum for eugenicists to share ideas with one another while promoting their cause in a professional manner. One notable figure who came out from this group was known as founder of American Eugenics. His name was Charles Davenport. He was a biologist and the director of the Eugenics Records Office. He also helped to found numerous organizations related to racial purity, including Immigration Restriction League in 1894, and an organization called Race Betterment Conference 1915. He created a model for tracking family history to determine if traits were passed down genetically. The influence of eugenics on the East Coast was huge. A man named Gregor Mandel worked out a model for tracking family history to determine if traits were passed down genetically. The man's work was important because it led to discovery that some traits are dominant and other traits are recessive. What's ironic is the master race traits are all recessive. So, where's the evidence? I don't know. 60% of the institutionalized Americans were sterilized, many in the names of preventing mental illness or chronic diseases. In the early 1900s, eugenics was all the rage in America. It was a pseudoscience that claimed to use genetics to improve humanity. In practice, it meant sterilizing people with mental illness and other disabilities as a way of preventing them from having children who could suffer the same conditions. But this is the narrative they hid behind. According to the statistics released by American Civil Liberty Union, ACLU, 60% of institutionalized Americans were sterilized, many in the names of preventing mental illness or chronic disease like epilepsy or schizophrenia. The number is much higher than both World War II's casualties and 2% of Baldwin's genocides. In 1927, Supreme Court Justice Oliver, I'm gonna have to do a series on this because the specific cases where women were forcibly sterilized is the most shocking part of the story. But in 1927, Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes ruled that forced sterilization was perfectly acceptable, writing that 3 generations of imbeciles was enough. And the case in question was brought by Carrie Buck, who was forcibly sterilized in Virginia at the age of 18 after being deemed feeble-minded by State Welfare Committee. The ruling set a legal precedent for states across America to follow suit until it was overturned in 1972 by Roe v. Wade, which legalized abortion. So also keep that in mind. The reason why I bring up the topics of eugenics, even though it's super cringe and super scary, that these people could have just looked at someone like me and said, oh, yeah, you're feeble minded. You can't have babies anymore. And if I was really mad about it and I was throwing a fit, they could have put me in an insane asylum. They abused these terms and stretched them. This was a pseudoscience, so they could have just had their own hysteria, labeled you as crazy, and locked you away. It's just like the idea, like, where if the media ever wanted to target somebody, they could just easily create all these crazy articles and plant evidence all around this person and say, oh my God, this person's crazy. They're heinous. Lock them up. And what would society do? Society is not going to think to investigate. Society is going to take the bait and then crucify that person. Or maybe that's what happened to Jesus. But anyway, so now we know right now that Roe versus Wade was a recent law that was again overturned. So Roe versus Wade helped us have the right of choosing when we want to have children. Let's see if our officials are going to try to implement sterilization again as a punishment. Like, oh, you're not vaccinated, you're getting sterilized, you're feeble-minded. Like, that's what I think about when I'm being pressured to get a vaccine that's experimental, where the side effects of the vaccine aren't even public. So why would I take it? Like, a doctors prescribe us medication all the time. They tell us what benefits it will give us, but I've never met a doctor that says, oh, well, these side effects, I don't know if it's worth it. You might have to get on another medication to prevent this side effect. It might cause clotting. Like, they don't tell you what side effects come with the medication. They just give you pills. They don't tell you, oh, you have a you're getting chronic bronchitis. Well, maybe we should test the air in your house. Maybe you have mold in your house. No, they don't ask you those things. They just give you medication. Overall, eugenics has a profound influence on the East Coast, and it continues to play a role in shaping our society today. While most people think eugenics as a relic of racist American history, it's important to remember that this belief system still very much exists today. We need to pay attention if we want any hope of preventing future atrocities like those committed during the Holocaust. I know this was a rough topic, but this only happened 100 years ago. And there's so many more cases of young women who were forcibly sterilized. Let's stay aware. Like, let's not take our safeties for granted, because like our last video about public outrage and the FDA, they didn't start checking our goods until the public was raging. Okay, like Chicago's meat factories during the book The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, that factory wasn't shut down and people didn't get rights until they were protesting. I'm not encouraging anyone to protest, but I'm encouraging everybody to do your own research. So be safe, and I'll see you on the next download.